Bruce, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Joe. I'm really happy to be here, mate.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit about your business and your background and how you sort of got started in everything?
Okay, well, as you can probably see by my head and grey hair, I've been in business for a long time. So I started in 1985, straight from university. I had a business mentor / mate who was a classic entrepreneur and a mate of Chris Skase at the time up in Brisbane. And I naturally was interested in computing, and I ended up with a business that he'd met the founders of, and I became the third founder, if that makes sense. And we built that one up from 85. But my actual qualifications is to manage an underground coal mine. So every day I wasn't down a coal mine working was a happy day. So I was very eager to get into tech. And so my first company, I started at 30th of June, and I turned 21 on the 6th. So that was a long time ago. Yeah, so that was sort of how I got into technology right at the earliest days of IBM compatible, PCs and, the really early days of stuff.
From an entrepreneurial point of view, were you always entrepreneurial, or was that something you learned as you went along?
I've never used the word entrepreneur. It just is one that I picked up like 20, 30 years later from when I started. But when I moved from young in New South Wales in 75, unbeknown to me that my parents' business had been hit with a little the credit squeeze, I just went up there and in year 6 or 7, I started selling newspapers in the middle of a busy road, which you can imagine nowadays. Imagine a 12-year-old standing there with a pile of telegraphs selling them. But that was what I did. And I had a target in life. I wanted to buy a skateboard because they'd just come out, and I thought, this is the best way. And I'd get a whole 1 cent per newspaper, and I realized I had to sell 5,000 newspapers to buy a skateboard. And then I found it a lot easier to sell cigarettes, single cigarettes in the day. And I stood in the middle of the road on the island, and I would have a pile of telegraphs and a couple of packets of cigarettes, and I'd sell them individually to people, which was as weird as a heck. But that was, and I didn't smoke myself, and I never did. So it was a funny way to start. But that sort of petered out as I got into high school, and I did the usual sort of after school holiday jobs, etc. And again in a news agency in a coal mining town. Hence why I ended up my career in coal mining for a short period of time.
Most importantly, did you get the skateboard though in the end?
Yes, I did. And it was a piece of crap.
But there's lessons in that, right?
Yeah, it was funny because this would have been like the mid-70s, and I wish I'd kept it. It was probably worth a fortune. But that's the same of everything that you get in the pier and throw away, and then one day you think, oh. But yeah, no, it was good fun.
Fast forward to now, you're involved in the business Humanforce. Tell us a little bit about that and the most recent sort of transactions around where you're at now.
Straight from university, I went into a company, and that I did for just on 20 years. And so that was I exited in, about 2002, and we'd floated on the Australian Stock Exchange and gone through the whole dotcom, bomb, et cetera, et cetera. And so then when I started Humanforce, I deliberately didn't look for external capital. I was fortunate enough I had just enough to start the business, and we built that up for 20 years. Always with the plan of an exit. Didn't, like on the macro sense, I didn't take capital until within, I think, around probably 18, deliberately, because I'd been sort of messed around with by some of my VCs in the dotcom days, and I floated on the ASX in post-crash. And so, when the music stopped, it got a bit ugly. So I was sort of a bit burnt by that. So I deliberately lived within my own means and bootstrapped for, 20 years.
Yeah, okay. And how important was that in terms of, would you do that differently if you had your time over, or was that the right move given what you'd been through?
If you're an entrepreneur, your experience is like a patchwork quilt, and it keeps you warm, but some of them are not the most impressive things to hang on to. They sort of shape your view of the world. I probably would have taken capital earlier in hindsight, because I came just before not before the wave started to break, but it was still, I think I would have got probably a better deal had I gone a year or two earlier than I did. And also the business was we were rapidly moving to a SaaS only business, but because we'd been around for 20 years, we also had a lot of on-premise technology. That said, I think we were the 7th client of AWS in Australia when they had we're working out of a terrace in Paddington. So we were early adopters, but we really didn't move fast enough to be a pure SaaS play. And that was probably, we were addicted to the fact that we were selling tens of millions of dollars worth of licenses every year, and then had an annuity stream beyond that of support, the old support and maintenance model. But as soon as we started to see it, and I brought a good CEO in, and he had a really strong understanding of SaaS metrics and SaaS marketing, that was the start, and he's the CEO still to this day.
And just for the listeners' benefit, do you want us to describe what Humanforce does as a business?
We were a purely workforce management solution that was doing rostering and scheduling for complex businesses, and predominantly for what we would define as a standing workforce. So that hospitality, retail, and I kept looking for scale and in that space. So our biggest competitors historically were Kronos, many billions of, tens of billions of dollars value company, and it was good just having a 1,000-pound gorilla. And that was always my target, was to outperform them in the marketplace, and that meant both functionally and as far as the business offering was concerned. So that was sort of where we were, and we ended up, to give an example, when we went to the UK, our first client there was Wembley Stadium, with like 2,500 people coming to work in an hour. We were using their finger veins to do their identity.
Yeah, right. That's incredible, isn't it? You see the stadiums. I don't think the average person really grasps just how many people are involved in making that all work.
Well, our actual background with that was years ago. We did the Sydney Convention Exhibition Centre, and then subsequently ICC. And our first stadium was the Sydney Football Stadium. And it was really interesting because it was an event. It was no different to like a convention centre. It was an event, and it had a lot of people coming through. And those stadiums and those convention centres, they sweat them a lot more nowadays than they used to, because they used to just sit there waiting between games. And now, all of this, where Wembley had a strong convention business as well that sat beside that, because they had all the facilities there. And so that was through a US-based catering company that they would have tendered for the contract for that. And they basically took us around to all of their major venues, which was a great way to expand the business. And then, we picked up a French global catering company, and that, took us into the continent as well.
Yeah, okay. And in terms of that, obviously, your first UK client, you said Wembley. That's obviously exciting in terms of the potential and what that means. What must come with a lot of pressure as well, to get it right. I mean, that's critical. That like, just describe that as you go. You've got the excitement of, wow, we've got this great client, high profile, but then also there's, you've got to get it right, right?
Yeah, look, even more so in that there was like wage theft happening. It was rampant in that casual business, because it's a casual business, and so therefore you always have to sort of slightly over schedule, over roster, because of people no shows, etc., and managing that. And then we found there was at one of our venues in the world, or I can't, I won't say which one it wasn't Wembley, but they had wage theft. They had people there that were being delivered in a van. 10 people coming out of a van, one person, using different fingers to fraudulently clock in using and so, and that whole, and these were workers who were basically being kept under duress.
Yeah, right.
Modern slavery, and we talk about it in Australia, but it's a real thing, and was very much a real thing in London, particularly just pre or just post their Brexit, particularly when they were open to the EU. It was just a flood of slave labor, and it was genuine slave labor. Like they were literally going back and being held against their will, to terrace houses with 20 people in it. Yeah, and we were fortunate that our software picked up the fact that a lot of them were using the same bank account for their pay to be paid into.
Okay, yeah, right.
And they're all different names and all different people, but it was all going into one account. And that was when that happened. That wasn't at Wembley, but it was a pretty high profile one, and the company didn't want to be, they were happy to point out that they'd found it, but they didn't want to, say much more about it, which I understood.
Fair enough, because that's fairly well organized, presumably behind the scenes. It's not.
Oh, yeah, that was just just genuine organized crime and slave labor. So a bit nasty, but they were nice things to do. Mate, you slept well when you did that. A piece of software picked it up. Went, yeah, well done, boys. Boys and girls in the team, we nailed that one.
Yeah, it's very cool applications, right? As a founder of a business, what would you say your biggest strength was when you started, and is it still your biggest strength today?
Yeah, just optimistic. Like I'm in my late 50s. I'm really optimistic. I'm excited about what we're doing now. I've always looked, I make lots of mistakes. I see that my success rate always has a correlation to mistake rate. And, I'm not like the California version of, you fail and fail off. And I mean, but I want to make sure I get the lessons from that. But yeah, I think, as far as, personally, it's like, how do I feel about technology businesses? I think, it's just probably the best time right now. I felt like through the sort of the boom period that there was just too much going on. Like it was just too extra, the whole marketplace. But now it's like, I found it to be, like a really good time to be in technology.
You're talking about, you sort of had that tech boom most recently, that sort of around October, November 2021, from a stock market point of view, started to pull back. But before that, you had a lot of excess across and I guess even just in terms of employing people, right? Because the big tech firms were just grabbing everybody. Since then, they've made a lot of redundancy. So that's changed the landscape. You're talking about that sort of normalization since that peak?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, that it was a dotcom one, and I really liked it. It was like a big surfboard carries a lot of waves. The big wave carries a lot of surfboards. Sorry, that was a terrible misquote. And back in the day in Bondi, they used to carry a lot of other stuff as well. And I just sort of sat there and I thought, and that wave it feels like it didn't crash like it did in 2000. Like it just didn't, like it just wasn't like dotcom. We woke up one morning and the NASDAQ had crashed and the world changed in technology. But it feels like it's slowly breaking on the shore. And to be honest, I didn't want it to break. I felt like, for once, tech companies were, had a voice at the table in the commercial realm, and still do. But, for a long time, post .com, it was a really difficult time. Hence why I never raised capital, because it was just too hard. Valuations were too difficult. And the company I eventually went with, Excel KKR out of the Valley, I mean, they started in 01 or 2000 or 01 or 02, something like that. And so they really were frugal and sort of suited my mentality as far as, application of funds, etc.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's an interesting process. And if you look at the .com boom and bust from that 2000, 2001, I think probably a lot of the differences is there's a lot less revenue back then in terms of the tech companies versus now. Tech companies typically, not all of them obviously, but they're much more conscious, I think, today in terms of generating revenue. Profit might be another question in some cases, but back then you had the sort of, mypet.com and all that sort of stuff at the peak of that bubble, right?
Oh, it was totally silly. And I remember sitting there, and I can't remember the exact .com it was, but it was floated. And I remember sitting there thinking, I've got a real business with real clients. I came out and ran an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald a million years ago when IBM came out and said they'd lost $1 billion, and I ran an ad saying we made 1 billion more than IBM this year. They were a main competitor in e-commerce.
Yeah.
But, and that was like, imagine losing, I think it was $1 billion. It was an enormous number, whatever it was. We actually, we quoted where we got it from, the data. But I think that technology at the moment is in a fantastic position. I mean, the ability, like I've got a startup I'm doing at the moment. I was the 7th client of AWS when they first opened in Australia, and they were in a terrace in Paddington. And of course I've gone back to them again this time around. And it's really interesting. It's like how simple, efficient, and genuinely easy to be able to start to build a scalable business.
Yeah, that's been a game changer, right? Just even AWS. I mean, the amount of companies that are very well known across the world that actually built on that tech versus running everything yourself, it's just a completely different ballgame, right?
Well, yeah, and particularly and then you throw Microsoft solution in as well, and a couple of other ones that are out there at the moment. I mean, you've got so many platforms to choose from. I mean, I'm sort of a little bit AWS biased because, I've been with them for such a long time and got a few friends that have, gone and worked there, et cetera. But yeah, I think there's never been a better time to be it's really funny. I was watching Alex Hormozi's thing yesterday, and I couldn't believe it. Like, it can't be a better time to be an entrepreneur, to be honest, at the moment. Like, even though money's tighter, it's still there. If you've got a good business, it's still there for you. I mean, I know, like with this one, I've already had people, doing some initial outreach as to what we are doing, etc. So they're out there looking for business, and I think I can't think of a better time. I mean, the late 90s and 2000 was exciting, but, I took capital in 1997, and we were one of 2 businesses. Only 2 got VC that year, and we were they had a convention up on the Gold Coast, and I think you've got to probably fit in a small boardroom at the time. But I remember that in 99, we got a deal across the line with St. George and Nanyang. And that was like, that was a big thing. They went to the convention on the Gold Coast and told everybody, whoa, we got a deal away. And Allen and Buckridge did an internal building, And so I look at it, probably think, having gone through this whole cycle twice, is that, right now, it's an incredibly good time to be an entrepreneur. And if you've got a real business and a real market to raise capital, it's still there.
Yeah. Sometimes I think having a little bit more normality about the situation rather than when it's too frothy and everyone's all in, like you're saying, when things come back a little bit, you can find people. There's all sorts of different parts that play into being able to get your business going. There's always going to be money for businesses that have got the right metrics, right? If you're good at what you do, that stuff will work itself out. The problem is when everything's going so well, everyone gets money. That's probably the problem, right?
Well, yeah, and it's funny you said that. It was like, because this Alex Hormozi yesterday was talking about his business, in acquiring businesses, and if you've got genuine EBITDA, and I thought, wow, there's a term I hadn't heard for quite a few years. But it was an interesting thing. I think he had like 200,000, 400,000, some insane number on this launch. And I think like the ability to do that, I think we're taking everything to the next level. Our conversations, the ability to be able to have 7 guys in Europe working for me at the moment, developing our product. It's just, it's so easy. My old business, you had the same thing. We've got them all over the world, great team members that, wherever they happen to want to be. It's a really good time to be in technology.
As a leader and a founder of a business, what would you say your biggest weakness was? How'd you overcome that along the way?
Well, as you probably guess, I talk a lot. Probably verboseness, where I should have been like at a personal level, like to be more taciturn. But look, I think everybody always has to have. There's a standard one VCs love. What's your primary weakness? And I always feel like I'm like Miss Universe. I've got to sort of go, this sort of thing. And for me, I'm like overly optimistic, and I've always been able to hit my sales targets. The thing that I struggled the most with, and the thing that I'm least optimistic around, is always my development costs. I've never budgeted it carefully enough or accurately enough on the cost of development, like bringing a product to market. Yeah, so that would be sort of the biggest weakness that I've had to sort of mitigate. And starting this business, I waited a full year after I left my old business, because it's not that close to my Humanforce. It's a fairly big pivot away from that. But I learned a lot from watching lots of recession, depression, and having grown up through the sort of halcyon years of entrepreneurism and etc. Meeting Chris Case and meeting Alan Bond and all these guys. And then, fortunate enough to, I never met Robert Holmes Court, but I met Peter, and we were in an organization together. And it was interesting just hearing the stories of those guys, because it's such a long time ago now. But I think that right now there's still plenty of capital out there for the right businesses with the right models. And I think there's a lot of people with a lot of dry powder looking for great opportunities and great entrepreneurs.
And I think some of that, you're talking about the 80s there, for the benefit of some of our younger listeners who probably have never heard of some of those names. But I grew up in WA, so I know those names around Alan Bond and a whole variety of people that were in that era. But I guess there's a level of sophistication that comes with capital markets and our businesses in general over time, right? And that part of has changed, where they were sort of old school entrepreneurs, probably a little bit on the cusp of what you should or shouldn't do. But the underlying sort of just go and get it and go for it type mentality was there. But these days there's a lot more layers and a lot more sophistication around the way people grow and do business, right? And it's more mature in the ecosystem, I guess.
One of the great joys I've got since I exited the business is I'm working with my former partner from one of the big four, and my former lawyer, he was a founding partner in a law firm, and their ability, they're young entrepreneurs, and we're investing in some really smart technology companies. and that have got good revenue and are not like, they're already well on their way. And it's just interesting the level, like to be an entrepreneur back in the day. Yeah, the ones that you would have grown up as a kid, admiring, and myself were like, they were just straight up, wheeler dealer entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
not robber barons back in the 30s, but it was interesting that, the skill set that an entrepreneur needs nowadays is, and
Yeah.
particularly for the young ones who've built some great businesses through this last sort of, peak, have just, the width and depth of information and skills they've got is really admirable. Like I'm close to a couple or three actually, and they're just killing it. Like it's just a totally different level of skill to run these businesses now, where before it was you build a product, you had a sales team that went out and you sold it, you hustled around the price, all of the usual stuff. And nowadays it's probably about 12 different metrics that the business is measured on, and these guys are well definitely 10, and they're on top of, and girls as well, girls and guys, not being gender biased, are really on top of their game.
I mean, they've got their dashboard. They know all the numbers they need to hit. They know where they're at. And they're not just winging it. This is really, really sophisticated metrics, right? That they are on top of. What about the best decision you ever made as you were in that sort of process of growing the business? But this is before you exited. What was the best decision that you made along the way?
With experience, which is usually built off mistakes, it was always built off mistakes in my mind. Everything is a good experience. I didn't work out in my last business. I thought I could do it all the way through to public company, etc. This business, I had met a young guy who is now the CEO of the business. We became good friends. He gave me advice over the period of time. And I realized that as the company grew and we got further and further down the line of being a pure SaaS play, etc., that I needed to bring in somebody who was a SaaS native mentally, if that makes sense. And he had this is Clayton, who's the CEO of the company now, and I'd known him since he was like first year of uni. And so he was the perfect person because he had grown up in this. He'd worked in large organizations. Through IBM, through Cisco, et cetera, et cetera. But particularly Cisco, because became a huge fan of customer success and CX motion. And when Clayton came, he was still working at Cisco and had everything in their WebSphere space. So he had a phenomenal background and purely at SaaS. And that was when I realized that I was possibly a dinosaur and I needed to work out that I didn't get hit by the meteor at some stage and this would give me cover. And hence, bringing him into the business was one of the best, decisions I'd ever made.
And when did you make that decision? When was that? When did that sort of transition, or when was the decision and when was the transition?
I had been trying to woo him and court him for ages, to be honest. And it was only once we got the capital, because he I remember seeing him on the front page of the AFR's top 6 or 10 or top 6 young executives. They do that each year, the AFR Boss magazine.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember texting him and saying, "Oh, congratulations, mate. Does this add X thousands to your salary?" And he said, "Probably 10 next time is what you just wrote."
Yeah.
I'll wait a bit longer because he's at IBM then, and he got headhunted and went to Cisco, I believe. I probably got that wrong, and if he watches this, he'll be embarrassed. But yeah, no, he was one of the great things that you've got to get that as an entrepreneur, is that you've got to pave the way for you to exit, and you have to have that person that can bring in as your CEO, bring in that levels of discipline that if you're a genuine entrepreneur that you possibly don't possess. That said, some of the entrepreneurs that I've invested in over the last year have got both sets of skills, where historically I'm more like the Alan Bond type, where you just make do and get it done. I'm looking at the metrics that these companies that we're investing in, and they're just incredible, as I mentioned before.
You've mainly exited Humanforce now. That's right.
I kept a little bit, yeah, no, because I sat there and I thought the last thing I want to do is not keep a chip on the table.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I had a majority share in the business, and I've got a very small minority equity piece in the business.
How difficult was that? Bruce, in terms of making that decision to move on, to let the business grow to where its next phase? Was it tough? Maybe it wasn't.
I mean, I think that's the job description. You know what I mean? Like if you found a business, you've got to sit there. And I remember I had a great client who was a big retailer. He's still a big retailer. And I remember visiting his office, and he just bought a building up opposite above where he had his first shop. And we went upstairs, and there'd been this path where an insurance broker had walked every day. And you could see when all the furniture came out before they re-put the carpet in, where he'd walked for 20
Yeah,
years.
right.
And I remember talking to this mate of mine, and he said, let's not be like him. Let's not be like this guy. We don't want to. And it's always been my mind is like, am I wearing a path in the carpet every day where I should be doing something else? And it was a melancholy choice, because it's sort of, if it isn't your baby, then you probably, you know, for me, it was, it was something that we started with, two blokes well, one bloke and then a programmer. So that was 20 years down the road. I think you would be unrealistic if you are a company founder and didn't have some feeling of sadness. Now, as one of the VCs said to me, they said, that's okay. Use your wallet as a pillow. You should be able to sleep at night okay.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, that's
Which I thought was a
ultimately,
pretty good line.
yeah, no, that's a
So,
great line. At the end of the day, you've got to weigh up and be pragmatic in the same way. And like you say, there's comes with that on that door closes to a point, but then there's other opportunities too. And then there's new things. You've been doing that for 20 years. Well, the next phase is actually you're starting with a blank canvas in many respects, and that's actually pretty exciting as well.
well, yeah, I mean, if I turned my boardroom here and showed you the whiteboard, you'd see exactly what we're doing. It is exciting. It's nice to be able to sit there. We're trying to do something at the moment, which I think has got like a 60-40 potential to fail if we don't work really hard at this point in time to get it across the line, because we're doing something that nobody's done before. And that's a bit scary, to be honest, because before I was working with other, organizations. This one we're creating something like brand new in the HR space. And so I've got some consternation around that at the moment, but you know what, if it works, we'll hit it out of the park. And if it doesn't, we'll, look to where the pivot is in it. But at this stage, the few clients we've talked to that have approached us have been, very excited. So, that's the joy of, starting a business where you get, potential clients who want to get on board for the trip. And, and I enjoy that phase very much.
You find that reinvigorating? There must be an element of that, right? Where I mean, as much as you might have enjoyed what you were doing, there's something new and exciting just hasn't, or is it different emotions?
It's different emotions. So I started my first one when I was 21, the second one when I was 39. This one I'm 59. I just really enjoy it. It's really good. We've got some phenomenally smart young team members working with us. And I was disappointed when ChatGPT came out, because it suddenly made this AI, like, I mean, everybody loves it and I enjoy using it, but we were doing AI not around that sort of area, but around like just your AI around HR function, etc. And I hope that, right at the moment, I can't think of a better time to have gone into AI, because of, it's starting to blossom, but it's just a little scary with some of the issues that are being seen as issues. And I worry about that a little bit, because we are heavily invested in a AI-based solution at the moment. And I'm concerned about whether regulatory, how they will, try to catch up or keep up with what's happening. So that's sort of like the only concern I've got with this new business is that it's inordinately built around AI, and we're dealing with people's information, which you sort of go, yeah, okay. So that's about the only concern I've got. So, but I'm sure over time, like everything in technology, it will work its way out, and we'll have a good outcome, a great outcome.
Yeah, regulators are a tricky one, right? Especially with this sort of stuff, because they're playing catch up. Sorry, regulate, because it's the things they're trying to regulate are things that unless you regulate the entire world, the regulation's not probably going to do a lot to solve anything. It's probably a little bit of a waste of time in many respects, because people anywhere in the world can do AI. So to regulate one country over another becomes kind of a waste of time, because you're not going to stop what they're trying to stop. In many respects, you got to let it go.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But I mean, I'm used to being in Australia where we're happy, particularly like what I used to do in workforce with awards and workforce regulations and industrial relations. And, I got so knotted up in that, I ended up being a respondent at the Industrial Commission myself, purely because, Australia loves a good regulation and always has. There's only us in California that are as regulated when it comes to workplace and workforce rules. So, I'm just concerned about that. My two target markets are, Australia and California, and both are very strong at regulation, which is, once again, that's where we're focused on. But it possibly would be easier. UK was difficult with EU rules, but it became a little more laissez-faire once they exited. All new technology carries with it some sort of way of selling newspapers and etc. And I think AI is doing that at the moment. I think it'll disappear. That my hope is that we have the right regulations around it and not governments overextend themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. My view that regulation might be a little pointless in some respects, won't stop governments from deciding that it's a great thing to regulate. That's the flip side of that, unfortunately, but it all plays out. In terms of advice you've been given along the way, Bruce, what's some of the best advice you've ever been given?
Look, to be honest, Dion, just the real basic stuff. My business career started in '85. That was like the halcyon days of, greed is good, cash is king, and et cetera, et cetera. And I've always had these things. It's like that same gentleman that I was talking about with the office. He had a full page that had been printed out on some ancient printer or copy that said, cash flow is vanity, margin is sanity. And it's always hit me, that one is like, but with a SaaS business, it's such a different beast, the metrics and making sure that we've got the right, particularly at your CAC, that has to be right. And I watch a lot of companies and I look at their cost of acquisition, and I have to sort of back end it out of a public company to really get a clear view. And yeah, I mean, it's just a lot more scientific. When you used to sell a license and then get a recurring revenue on your support and maintenance, it was pretty much just a capital sale with a small trail. Nowadays, with the cost of unraveling bad solutions and the market consequences on those, the real marketplace in technology now is coming through like a microservices thinking. Like, how do we build this business where we can start to build it up and not big bang it? But yeah, I guess that's sort of where my thinking is at the moment around what you're asking.
Yeah, okay. A few quick ones to finish off. Business person that inspires you the most?
I was really fortunate. I was in Fog City Bar or Fog City Lounge in like 1988, and I saw Steve Jobs and fell in love with him. I said g'day to him, and then the next night I went there, he wasn't there. Robin Williams was. So I think I had like, this is 1988 in January, and I've got a couple of old grainy photos of both those nights, and like literally on a film camera. Because of that, and having met him and just watched him, and then watched the whole thing, and John, Scully coming in. Yeah, it was, I think they were good because I can understand why Steve had such a cult following, especially just before he passed. I always get the quote wrong because I actually just looked it up before because I thought you'd ask something along these lines. And I think I always said that he talked in my presentation that we talked about that his Apple wanted to be at the intersection of the liberal arts and technology. And I quite like the idea that you could have something more than just technology and technology. That showed itself, and then when he turned his product launches into an art form, that sort of defined a period of technology and technical growth. But I'm really fond of what we're doing now. Or just looking at the way that there's still opportunities. Like this, AI, and particularly in the Valley at the moment. It's just the micro, like they're not like a vertical, they're like a pipette, like a little tiny sliver.
Yeah.
Boy, are they interesting, and so much effort's being put into them. So yeah, that's what I'm excited about, at the moment. It's easy to say, Steve, but there's a couple other ones. I quite liked Maria, I can't think of her surname. She was at Cisco, and she really was the godmother of customer success and CX. She's got a blue book. Yeah, they're sort of my heroes, I think, the old school ones. People I'm fond of at the moment in Australia, I think the market, because I was involved with workforce and stuff. Marcus Zeltzer from Yellow Canaries, a phenomenal business. He's really doing very well there. And then there's another chap that I'm been following quite a long time, Richard from Adiona, who's doing route optimization, but is just purely on a green platform, which is like using the world's oldest tech, the newest tech for the oldest thing, and rerouting delivery trucks and all sorts of stuff. And so those sort of businesses to me are really exciting.
Oh, what about business books? Any that you've read long time ago or recently that sort of have struck a chord?
The early ones were all very old. I mean, I'm talking about 30s and 50s stuff, like Think and Grow Rich with Napoleon Hill. And I don't think anybody my age wouldn't have read those books. I still think I've recommended them to, like young entrepreneurs. And to be honest, I'm really like currently I've got a pile of books beside my bed and beside my desk that I continually are reading. Right at the moment, I'm reading a mate of mine, Daniel Priestley, over in the UK, Aussie. Dent Global's his business, and he's building a really smart business around an app purely around scorecards and, being able to score, and basically using that as your funnel for bringing somebody into your business. And I sort of sat and looked at it and went, yeah, that doesn't look much. But the more I've looked at it and the more I'm watching their growth, and it's just taking off. And, it just proves that you can still do something very simple. And as long as it's elegant and technically clever, it'll have a market. But yeah, they're the sort of things I'm reading at the moment. And 1 million leads. I bought that book. I was one of the suckers and that got online and immediately bought it after that. I just was happy to see something that gargantuan. Like, it has to be one of the biggest ever online meetings or online presentations yesterday. So yeah, that was, I felt, was like a turning point in marketing.
Yeah. And what about quotes? Anything that you live by, or anything that you sort of fall back on when things are tough, or anything along those lines?
I think that the quotes are good when you're on the up. I think that when you're when you're in the down and you just sort of, you're driving home and you don't want to be asked by your partner or your wife or your flatmates, like, how was your day? And you just do not want to tell them how crap it was, because invariably that's because some of your mistakes are starting to, what is it that, the hens are coming back to the hen house and the size of emus or escaping. And you just, I always lean on a lot of Think and Grow Rich and those sort of things. All of the, what I would call the classics, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, those sort of older books where it was very much rah-rah, but sometimes you need that stuff where you just got to sit and think, what would, this person do in this situation? And I always try to, I studied NLP and quite a lot. And I always think in those situations, I've got to sort of think as if, like, okay, if I'm my accountant, if I'm that client, if I'm, where I've gotten myself into an issue, if I'm that lawyer, if I'm this person that's causing me some angst, if I'm that client who didn't go ahead, if I'm that client who decided to not keep the product, those situations are when you drive home and someone's going to ask you, how was your day? And you've got to go, yeah. And I think it's those times when you need to, like, I remember as an engineer, you learn first principles. And I think the first principles as an entrepreneur is you are given the same as everybody else, 24 hours, go to sleep the best you can, get up the next day and fix it.
Yeah. Those older school books that you're talking about, a lot of those were about mindset and attitude and how you perceive the world and what, thinking big and all those types of things, right? So, and there's a lot of value in that. And that does give you something to not just fall back on, but a paradigm shift too. If you start to think that way, I think there's a lot of benefit in it.
I'm probably not a person who's ever, I reckon I've had sort of like a genuine, like, clinical depression probably twice in my life. And once I did that, I went, okay, now I understand it. For a long time, I didn't understand how people with business could get that way, because I woke up every day going, it's another day, let's make it happen. My philosophy around that is that tomorrow is a promise, yeah, and today is the reality. So, let's get going on today. And, it's like this conversation, I wanted to think about being prepared, but I knew that you would probably, having watched a couple of your previous ones, that they sort of, you meander down different roads and et cetera. So, in this situation, I think that you're asking, that's where you're in a self-confidence, your genuine self-confidence. Either will take a beating, or you've just got to lean on it and go, you know what, if I keep fighting the good fight, which is a term I use all the time, Bruce, fight the good fight. Don't sit there and fight a bad fight. That's not what you're here to do. I think you can come through it. And I've seen that, not just with myself, but, people working with me and other entrepreneurs when they've had their down days. And I think everybody needs somebody to call up and just go, this is sucking at the moment. I need, I need a hand.
That's part of life, right? I mean, one of my favorite quotes is by a German philosopher called Goethe, and he just talks about life, and he says, enjoy it when you can, endure it when you must. And I live by that, because to me, that's very profound. It's like, have fun when you can, but when you can't, and you've just got to battle on, just battle on. Like, there's nothing else you need to do. So it kind of simplifies things a little bit, it just, I like that one.
Yeah, it's a good quote. Yeah. Nothing that we're doing hasn't been done before. I mean, I'm sure there was, when Jesus walked through the markets, there were people there that had too much stock, weren't selling enough, stuff was going off, there were problems with suppliers. I mean, and we got a couple of thousand years of commerce. And I still think every day you're reborn again. Like it's you've got the opportunity to to fix it. And you're right with the Gerda quote, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of your next phase, what's next for you, for your business? What's ahead?
Breaking ground on a new product. I'm nervous that it will work, which makes me happy because I've always had that nervousness where I'm fortunate that my life partner in first year of college, that's good in that she is a good sounding board. So I've always been able to go to her and say, I've got concerns here. I think it's always good to have somebody as a cheerleader in your team. I don't think anybody it's an incredible person who can do it purely on their own. For me at the moment with this business, I'm having second thoughts on my ability to be able to read the market. And so therefore, I'm bringing in a couple of people that I know well who have got good feel around the market we're looking at and letting them do some of the entrepreneurial process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. That's fresh eyes too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you also, as when you have a business, it's easy to get sycophants.
Everyone's all on board, but you're the one who holds when it all goes bad.
Because I always work on who's still there with me at the end of the day. It's old school, whether it be actually in physically or heart and mind. It's like you don't have to be there. I mean, back in the day, that was it. But I always sort of sit there and think, okay, so if this went pear-shaped like this new thing I'm doing now, what will I do with the people I've got on board? What will I do with the product? I'm already thinking like the yin and yang logo. So what's the dark side of this one? And if we completely get it wrong, what didn't I do now? So I'm doing forward projection to go, okay, this has gone to poo. We didn't talk to enough potential clients. We didn't do enough market research. We didn't do enough research because we're doing stuff in psychology, etc. We didn't get the right people to assist us. I'm just doing a what if, like well ahead, looking out a year and saying, okay, we spent, 7+ figures on launching this thing. What could we have done better?
Okay. That's the joys of business, right? Bruce, thanks very much for joining us on the show. It's been fantastic.